So you're all very welcome to this event to mark 30 years of EAPN Ireland's work. So just before we begin, we just wanted to let you know that the event is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, you might switch off your video. And I see some people have done that already. And also if you can just leave your microphone on mute just while other people are speaking, that would really be good. So my name is Michelle Kearns and I'm the chairperson of the board of EAPN Ireland. And we are a network of 170 members drawn from local and national organisations and individuals, and we're all committed to ending poverty. So EAPN Ireland is part of a larger European network of 32 European networks and 13 European organisations, all of us working collectively together to end poverty in Europe. And we do this by continuing to put the eradication of poverty on the agenda of European and Irish policy makers. Despite this collective work, poverty continues to be an issue in 2020, with 630,000 people at risk of poverty in Ireland today and 92 million in the EU at risk of poverty and social exclusion. And we're hoping that this event will give an opportunity to reflect on the experiences of that fight against poverty across the EU, and to draw on lessons which will inspire all of us to work together and continue the fight against poverty into the future. Just before we start, because EAPN is 30 years old, I think it's important just to briefly remember how EAPN Ireland and Europe began their work and what we've achieved to date. So in terms of the origins of EAPN Ireland and Europe, it had their origins in the 1980s when the EU anti-poverty programme recognised the importance of including the voice of communities experiencing poverty in the policy making process and in the design of EU programmes. EAPN Ireland, and Fintan is here, played a role in the establishment of EAPN Europe. And over the years, the work of the networks has been to mobilise communities and organisations working with people in poverty and to ensure the work together to give a voice to those experiencing poverty and to keep the issue of poverty on the agenda, high up on the agenda. And while there's no doubt that poverty continues to be an issue in Ireland and across Europe, we've had some successes. So we have managed to keep the issue of poverty on the EU agenda and its member states. And we've maintained the voices of people living in poverty in our work and in our policy objectives. And we do this through our organisations, our network members, and through our annual general meetings of people experiencing poverty. So between 2000 and 2010, we played a role in ensuring the commitment to reduce poverty became one of the objectives of the Lisbon Treaty. And we played a role in monitoring the government's plans and actions to address poverty. We focused and highlighted our government's progress on its poverty reduction targets, and most recently in terms of Europe 2020. Since our foundation, and most recently, we've played a role in coordinating the European Minimum Income Network, which has led out on the campaign for the strengthening of welfare and minimum income schemes across the EU, so that everyone who needs it has access to adequate and enabling welfare supports. This is also a key focus of EAPN Ireland, which coordinates work on the campaign for access to adequate social welfare in Ireland. Particularly since the economic crash in 2008, EAPN has actively and successfully engaged with the EU's economic policy, and particularly the European semester process, ensuring that while what was initially a focus on economic and budgetary policy also integrates a more balanced and social focus. And there's a challenge now in maintaining this approach in the current climate. EAPN played an important part in influencing the content of the European Pillar of Social Rights, and a real challenge as the EU drafts its action plan is for the implementation of that. EAPN Ireland has run a wide range of projects over the years, focusing on the EU minimum social standards, the Sustainable Development Goals, and more recently on health inequality. This event today invites us to reflect on the impact of our work to date and the work in Europe, and to look forward on how best to be effective in the fight against poverty. So just in terms of the agenda today, we have three speakers and we're really glad to welcome all three. We have our keynote speaker, Olivier de Schutter, is a UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, and you're very welcome. And from Fintan Farrell, he's the former director of the Irish Traveller Movement and EAPN Europe. You're very welcome, Fintan. And then Deirdre McCarthy is the Policy and Research Coordinator with the Dublin City Community Co-op. And so after the presentations, people will have an opportunity just for clarifications and questions. And then we'll go into just breakout groups for 5-10 minutes, a small group of people just having a chat about what you heard, and then come back into a larger discussion where we talk about the future and what we can learn from the past and how to be more effective in the future. So we hope to finish just, you know, in or around 11:15, just with the final closing remarks from everyone. So I hope that's okay and that you enjoy today, and that we all learned something, and that it kind of galvanizes us into the future for continuing the fight. So I'd like to invite Olivier. Olivier, if you'd like to start, just remind people to keep on mute.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for this introduction, and very warm welcome to all those who could join this, this dialogue on the occasion of this important anniversary. Let me perhaps note that we have achieved a lot, you have achieved a lot, but we still have lots of work ahead. And if we look at the commitments made when the Europe 2020 strategy was launched in 2010, the commitment there was to reduce the number of people in poverty in Europe by 20 million. And the figure was then 120 million in the EU 28. And today we have reduced slightly poverty, but the numbers remain high and certainly much higher than had been anticipated in the Europe 2020 strategy. Today, more than 1 out of 5 Europeans is still at risk of poverty. 21.8% is the exact figure before the COVID-19 crisis, and quite clearly the COVID-19 crisis and the measures adopted in the context of the fight against the pandemic has risen significantly the number of people in poverty. So there is still lots of work to do, and I think we have to reflect now on the obstacles that we encounter in trying to press for the issue of poverty, of extreme poverty, to be at the top of the political agenda. I would suggest there are at least 2 major challenges that we face. A first challenge is that anti-poverty policies are often pictured as welfare policies that benefit people in poverty alone rather than society as a whole. And therefore, many people in the middle class do not feel that extreme poverty is really an issue they should be concerned about. And the reason for this is primarily because we've been focusing anti-poverty strategies on basically compensatory mechanisms. We have markets that exclude, that discriminate, that leave many people behind, and then we have progressive taxation schemes and social policies that try to make up for the damage created by such markets. So we have, if you wish, post hoc or ex post compensatory strategies to try to combat poverty. And the result is that very often people see those policies as resulting in a transfer of wealth from those who are productive and successful in the modern economy to those who are less successful and depend on social support in order to make ends meet. And so that is in part what explains the lack of popularity of such measures and the inability for us to mobilize action across all of society. And I think the second challenge is that there is a dominant discourse about poverty that pictures people in poverty as being responsible for their own condition. They have, after all, poor qualifications that do not match the needs of the market. They have failed perhaps to seize the opportunities presented to them. Maybe they made the wrong choices. Maybe they are victims of various types of addictions. And the result of this discourse is that poverty becomes a source of shame, responsibilizing the poor, but de-responsibilizing society. And so I believe we have to challenge that way of thinking about poverty and that way of speaking about poverty. We need a different discourse, in fact, about equality, about poverty, and about social protection. We need a new discourse about equality to emphasize that more equal societies, more socially cohesive societies are societies that fare better on a number of issues, as illustrated, for example, by the important work in the UK of Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, who established the Equality Trust to press this message forward that equal societies work better for everyone, which is the slogan used by the Equality Trust. And that is, I think, an important message we need to continue pressing on the general public and on politicians. We need also a new discourse on poverty. Poverty, we should very explicitly state, is not a failure of the individual. It is a failure of society. It is the price we pay for having failed to build truly inclusive societies. And when the European Anti-Poverty Network speaks of poverty as a punishment that is inflicted upon people for a crime they have not committed, I think it's the kind of reframing of the question of poverty that we need to press further. We need also a new discourse on social protection. Social protection is often seen or pictured in mainstream discourse as a disincentive to work, but it is in reality an obstacle to people taking risks, to building human capital, to investing in education. And better social protection, stronger social protection, is a way to insure all people against the risks of existence, and thus to allow them to better plan their lives without the stress, without the shame of being unable to satisfy essential needs. And so we need a new discourse. We need also, I believe, a new, more imaginative approach as to how to combat poverty. As I said, our usual representation of anti-poverty strategies is post hoc, ex post, or compensatory, but we need also to think about pre-market mechanisms and how to change the markets so that they are more inclusive and so that no one is left behind. For example, by emphasizing the duty to avoid any discrimination on grounds of socio-economic disadvantage. That means ensuring that all the policies we adopt, the recruitment, the promotion policies, the training courses and so on, should be tailored to the needs of those who have been facing this socio-economic disadvantage, who are born in poverty and who have low incomes. And I think we should do much more with the anti-discrimination equality clauses that exist, such as is done in the UK with the positive duty imposed on local collectivities. So we need also to develop the social and solidarity economy. We need to develop, as they do in France, territories that are zero long-term unemployed. And I think these are the kind of innovations that will gradually broaden the panoply of measures that we take against poverty. We cannot simply continue to emphasize, although we also must emphasize that, the need for progressive taxation schemes and social policies. Number two, we need to adopt universal approaches rather than just targeted approaches to social protection. Adopting universal schemes, as we do in the fields of health, education, is far more effective in order to allow us to bring to the struggle against poverty the middle class that also shall benefit from these universal schemes. And targeted schemes create a number of risks, particularly of under-inclusion of certain groups that should benefit from the schemes, but are excluded because they don't have the right documentation, because they fear relationships with social services as a result of previous institutional or social abuse, because they do not fill in easily the forms on the online system that they are meant to connect to, etc. We know that targeted schemes, although they sound a good idea, as they look like a more efficient use of scarce public resources, in fact, are a source of exclusion and discrimination. And so we must move to more universal schemes, and that would be, I would suggest, the second direction in which to direct our efforts. Thirdly, we must move to rights-based schemes. We have seen, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, many governments who took measures in order to protect people from extreme destitution, for example, workers in precarious forms of employment or employed in the informal sector and so on, schemes that were not rights-based and that were basically presented as a charity provided by government or indeed by others in order to protect people from destitution. But framing that support in rights terms changes things in three ways. First of all, it changes the relationship between the service providers and the individuals who can claim support. This relationship should not be based on charity. It should be based on rights and duties, and it should allow the rights holders to claim against the duty bearers that they comply with certain obligations. This would remove the stigma, the shame from claiming benefits, which, as we know, is one of the major reasons for the non-take-up of rights. It would reduce the risk of discrimination and of selective provision of support to those who have a right to be supported, and it would allow people to complain before independent mechanisms if indeed they are excluded. Secondly, a rights-based approach means that social protection should not be depending on the fiscal space available to governments. I think it's a major problem that in many human rights instruments, the right to social security and more generally social rights are conditional upon the ability for governments to mobilize the maximum available resources to the effect of supporting people in poverty. And as a result, very often, the generosity of governments, the ability for social protection to expand is seen as the end result of a development process and the creation of wealth. In fact, it should be an ingredient from the start of the development process. It should direct our efforts, and it should be seen as an investment in order to make sure that whatever wealth a society creates, first and foremost, benefits people in poverty and is as equally spread as possible across society, rather than the wealth created being captured by a small elite at the top of the social ladder. Thirdly, emphasizing that the right to be protected from poverty and social exclusion is indeed a human right that people should claim to be able to benefit from, means that participation is essential in how the schemes are designed that are meant to support people in poverty. Participation is essential of social partners, of people with direct experience of poverty, not only because it allows the policies to be better informed and because it makes them more legitimate, but also because it ensures that, to borrow from the famous phrase from Richard Titmuss, services to the poor are not poor services. Very often, in the absence of effective participation of people in poverty, the services they are provided, the schools they have access to, the healthcare systems they benefit from, the kind of social support families obtain is of poor quality, and quality is something very difficult to measure in numbers. It can only be assessed quality by the people who are served or underserved by these various services, and implicating them in the design of the schemes, in the implementation, in the assessment of the social policies in place is absolutely essential to ensure that the quality of the services they are provided is indeed in accordance with what they have a right to. So that would be my message for this anniversary. We need to broaden our imagination as to how poverty can be tackled. We need to reflect about the discourse we use when speaking about poverty, and we have to challenge the dominant discourse that blames poverty on the victims of poverty themselves. And we have to anchor our fight for social justice and for poverty reduction strategies into the language of human rights. Many thanks.
Good morning to everyone, and thanks a million for including me in this celebration. I think it's really important to reflect on the 30 years that we have been working together on this. And I'm lucky to have been involved in the 30 years that EAPN has existed. So I really just want to go quickly through kind of a social policy history in the EU, building a little bit on the introduction that Michelle has already made, and then look at a little bit at what lessons are learned and how we could move forward in a useful way. So that's what I'll be doing in this presentation. Two parts to it, just a brief history lesson, and then trying to look at how we galvanize ourselves to go forward to achieve all that's still to be achieved. So first of all, in terms of, if you want to look at the start of social policy within the European Union, one of the places you could start is the EU poverty programs, which Michelle already mentioned, and they ran from 1975 to 1994. And they had real strengths because they financed a range of poverty programs and research. They really worked to develop common definitions of Europe. We began to be able to see that member states all had problems to address within their that poverty existed in all member states. That was one thing that was really hard to get across to people, that poverty existed in each member state of the European Union, and not just in the poorer member states. And it really developed approaches like recognizing the need to take multidimensional approaches to address poverty, the importance of participation, the importance of participation of people experiencing poverty. So a lot of things we take for granted now really grew out of those programs, and EAPN itself grew out of those anti-poverty programs. They were the NGOs who were involved in the programs who wanted to have a more permanent structure to work on. In 1992, there were two very important recommendations. One, which was really setting guiding principles for how member states would organize, how we would organize regular consultation with member states on the development of social protection policies. So that was quite an important step forward. And then the second one was a very important recommendation on common criteria to ensure sufficient resources and social assistance in the social protection systems of the member states. That's the one on which we've been working ever since to build this guaranteed, adequate, accessible and enabling minimum income schemes. And then when they tried to introduce the fourth poverty programme, the German and UK governments took the European Commission to court. They won the case to say that there wasn't competence within the EU to address the issue of poverty. So we had a big campaign to try to build a new treaty article, and it came about in the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1999, where you had a new article inserted where EAPN worked very hard on, so that social policy became a joint responsibility between the EU and the member states. To follow up that social policy, then we developed what was the Lisbon strategy from the period 2000 to 2010, which included in it, for the first time, a real European anti-poverty strategy. I was lucky enough to be present in the meeting of Ministers of Social Affairs at the European Council, and I was able to partake in that meeting, which established the Lisbon strategy. And it established a European strategy to fight poverty based on what was called the open method of coordination. During the time, each country had to produce national action plans on inclusion. It established common measures for how to, and indicators for how to measure the progress that was being built. And it provided a really clear framework within which organizations and social ministries and other actors, social actors could work. And we did achieve some successes during that period, but it was more marginalized from the bigger picture, and it kind of lacked the impact on the main economic strategies that were causing the problems that you were trying to deal with by social policies. So then what happened following that was that there was this big decision to mainstream social policy into the overall EU dominant strategy, which was called the Europe 2020 strategy. So this had a really important impact in terms of social issues were now the concerns of finance ministers, prime ministers, other ministers, and not just seen as a social affairs issue. It was very important that we won the setting of a European target to reduce poverty, which gave a very big visibility to it. And then you had this, what was called this semester, this economic and social process, which included country-specific recommendations to make sure that there was follow-up on it. But the weakness here was that we now had a mainstreaming of social inclusion into an overall strategy, but then we lacked a really detailed anti-poverty strategy and a social agenda. At the end of this period, apart from that pressure that came from saying, look, we need also a social agenda as well as the overall strategy, we succeeded to work with others to create what's the European Pillar of Social Rights, which becomes very important, 20 key principles on social issues that people should have rights to. And it's very important, as Olivia was saying, that this was set within a rights context. So that becomes very important as we go forward. So as we go forward, they're now setting up the architecture for the next period, so 2020 to 2030 sort of period. And what's really needed, if we're really going to try to make progress on the fight against poverty in the collective effort across Europe, is that we managed at the same time to have all the three things which existed separately over the last 30 years. So we need something that is the equivalent to poverty programs to really help people to work on the ground. We need something which is the equivalent of the European anti-poverty strategy to make sure that there is a real focus on poverty and social issues and a detailed focus. And we also need to have the social mainstream into the overall development strategy. So what's emerging, and the details of this, Manny and EAPN will know much better than me. What you have emerging as the overall strategy is the European Green Deal and just transition. And it is vaguely linked, or there are links to the Sustainable Development Goals, which can also be an important context as we go forward. But there's a real effort to try and build a strong social dimension within this overall strategy. At the moment, it is much more concerned with digital and environmental transition rather than the social transition. So there's a real fight to be done to try to achieve a real social mainstreaming within the overall sorts of strategy that's being developed for the period, for the next period. Secondly, there's the development of an action plan to follow up on the European Pillar of Social Rights. And this could become something that might be somewhat equivalent to having a European strategy for social inclusion and for social issues and for addressing poverty. And I know that there's a lot of social actors, including EAPN now, trying to really work to make sure that we maintain a strong anti-poverty target within this sort of strategy. So there's a lot of work being done on how that would be done, on to try to make sure that we achieve a poverty reduction strategy within that action plan on the follow-up of the European Pillar of Social Rights. And then what might be the equivalent of the sort of poverty programs that we had, we have to try to secure that within the next multi-annual financial framework, which is basically to do with structural funds, European Regional Development Fund, and what's called the ESF+. We have some clear ring fencing for social investments within the European Social Fund, and also within that fund you have FEAD, which looks at material assistance to people in extreme situations. So, but it has a real social inclusion logic. So we can try to build through that a type of inclusion program, a poverty program that really secures more concrete actions on the ground. Interestingly, also in the way it's shaping up for the future European Social Fund, you may have something which was a bit like community initiatives. People might have heard of the Equal Initiative. So there would be more of a chance to apply for a common project across Europe in the area of social inclusion than there has been in the last round, where it was all left devolved to the national level to deal with. So to become more accessible. So maybe we can build through that something the equivalent of a poverty support for real poverty actions on the ground. But there is a real danger, and people are really working very hard on this. It's possible that poverty and social issues might fall between these three stools. We might not manage to have the strong mainstreaming of social inclusion in the Green Deal. The battle about how we speak about poverty and what sort of target we might set on poverty is moving away from the well understood poverty as a relative sort of issue and trying to move towards more a target on extreme poverty. And this could be very difficult in terms of trying to build a society in a way that works for everybody. And so there's a real battle going on to try and look at what type of poverty target might emerge in the action plan to follow up the European Pillar of Social Rights. And then it is always difficult to work through these big structured funds processes to try and get money to the ground for real actions on poverty and social exclusion. But that's the battle, and that's what we have to do. I dream of the day when we will get all three things working really effectively together at European level. The second part of the presentation is just to speak a little bit about going forward and what sort of vision for going forward. I think it's really important that we set the fight against poverty and social exclusion within a broad vision, which is about a good life for everybody and making sure that people who experience poverty are included in that good life. So it is about something that works for everybody and not just something that's for the poor. It's a bit like what Olivia was saying, that the more equal societies work better for everybody. And we have to, of course, try to achieve that within respecting planetary boundaries. We need to build broad coalitions and strategies, and I think we need to bring new kind of more, maybe the creative, artistic sort of sector into this sort of approach to try to win and develop support for such a transformation. And I know everybody is very hard pressed at the moment working in their organizations, but it's really important that we give time to build these broader coalitions and to really build this sort of support for a greater transformation. And then within that broad approach, EAPN needs to have key targets that are specific to its area of work that can contribute to this overall vision. And I think they're there, and EAPN has been really working consistently on them. It's around the guaranteed, adequate and accessible income. It's around access to affordable and accessible public services. It's about participation of people experiencing poverty. And I really like coming across more strongly in recent EAPN publications, though it's always been there, but a much stronger focus on tax justice. And I think tax justice is a huge issue that maybe EAPN could spearhead with other sort of social organizations to really launch a campaign on this. Like Olivia, I have two key areas that I just want to highlight in terms of going forward. The first for me is that our vision for a social and sustainable development model must be based on the fight for democracy. Democracy and really non-violent sort of approaches are what work best to try to achieve a real society where everybody has access to a good life. And I think so we have to defend and hold to account the existing democratic structures that we have to work with at all of the different levels. We have to make sure that they realize that their mission is about a social and sustainable society. Sometimes I get really frustrated when I hear governments and ministers like as if their job is just to create conditions for free market economy to work. Whereas no, the job of democratic institutions is to ensure that we have a social and sustainable society. So the need to promote social market economies, we need to be insisting on tax justice, we need to look at redistribution, we need to look at that our democratic systems protect against discrimination and really work towards equality. And I think we also need to develop new thinking and new practices to try and enhance our democratic participation. And there are some interesting examples that are developing in that regard. Lastly, I think that we need to be really focused on a balanced social market economy. Now, I love this phrase, social market economy, and it sounds like it might be something coming from somewhere, but it's the key objective of the European Union within the European treaties is that the European Union is supposed to be supporting a social market economy, and not just a market economy, but a social market economy. And I think there are three elements to that we have to push and defend. First is that we have to really defend the need for a strong public sector. And we've seen in the crisis that's happened with COVID now, that only through strong public actions are we able to deal with such sorts of situations. So we need a public sector that's really involved and engaged, and also as an economic actor in the provision of essential services like health, education, social services, housing, water, energy, these sort of very key vital areas. And we should defend a public sector role within these key areas. I would really want to highlight the need for a social and solidarity economy. It's so underplayed, and it could be such a source for new ideas and for building new models of economy. In my experience, a lot of people now want more from their work than just financial gain. And if we look at the social and solidarity economy model, you have the situation where you generate wealth that can be public wealth and reinvested into the economy, rather than generating a wealth that goes into just private wealth. So we have to look at how we generate that. We could really generate active economies in communities that are experiencing market failures, and in a lot of rural communities all across Europe, the whole question of rural communities being vibrant is really being undermined by an overemphasis just on one type of market economy. I think you could really generate local circular economies through the promotion of social and solidarity economies. You could really support developments that are already happening in local communities. The last time I heard Olivier de Schutter speak, he really spoke a lot and seen a lot of very important local developments, which were very encouraging when we are working in a broader political context that sometimes is not so encouraging. So we really need to build on that, and it gives kind of an economic base and an economic possibilities for people to try to build power that's needed, the sort of transformation that we're trying to achieve. The market economy, it works, but it has to work for people and planet, and we need a level playing field so that the people who work within the market economy, who are working from a decent level, are not undermined by people who are just looking at a profit motive. You have to try to make sure that legally market economies are obliged to pay living wages, that they're obliged to ensure social standards in their supply chains, that they really have the polluter pay principle so that we really look at the real costs of what they're promoting, that they really meet environmental standards that has to be met, and that these should be legal and not just voluntary sort of areas. During the last big crisis, we had this whole idea of economic entities that were too big to fail, and we have this sort of thing where they are so big that you can hardly trace who is the real owner of some of the big companies which are producing a lot of the goods that we use in a daily way. Now, one of the ways to try to get control of that would be a transnational tax, financial transaction tax, which would create more of a way to try to control how money is moving through this big market economy works. So I suppose finally, I'm just saying that we really need to imagine a future for civil society as building the base and the power that's needed to achieve social and environmental sustainability, and to really create the transformation that's needed in our time. So this is what social and civil society has been good at. We must keep this we really need to keep this to the forefront of our work, that this is what we're about in civil society, about trying to build a better life for everybody and a world that works within planetary boundaries. So thank you very much for that.
So good morning, everyone, and I want to thank Paul and the EAPN for giving me this opportunity to speak with you this morning. I just lost my Wi-Fi there for a moment a few seconds ago, so if I wasn't feeling self-conscious enough about doing this thing over Zoom, that has certainly done the job for me completely. So if I disappear again, I apologise. Hopefully I'll be back quite quickly. So my name is Deirdre McCarthy, and I've worked with community development and anti-poverty organisations, primarily within the inner city of Dublin, over the last 20 years. I also spent a little bit of time working in Pavy Point and was on the central group of the Irish Traveller Movement, but that was after Finton's time and I think slightly before Paul's, so I managed to sandwich myself in between the two. And at the moment I work for Dublin City Community Cooperatives. So the co-op is quite a new organisation. It was established in 2014, and I'm really pleased to see one of our other founding members here today, Mark Hogan. So Mark would have been one of our early chair people. And that organisation has came together largely as a consequence of the changed funding environment in Ireland. And although the organisation itself is quite new, and we're all local community development organisations working in the inner city, most of the organisations have been around for an awful long time. So a lot of them you would probably know. So there's all of these organisations are members of the co-op, Icon, SICTA, who would be around for over 40 years in the South Inner City, on Shield, Northwest Inner City Network. So when I was thinking about what I was going to do today, and I think my piece is probably a little bit different, it's really an examination of sort of a potted history of anti-poverty work and the changing environment that we found ourselves working in from my experience in the inner city. And when I was thinking about doing that, two sort of particular pieces really struck my mind. One was the death of Fergus McCabe. I don't know if all of you know Fergus, but I had the pleasure and honour of working with Fergus on and off over the last 20 years, and he died very recently on the 8th of October. But his obituary in the Irish Times gives a really fascinating history of community development and anti-poverty work in the inner city of Dublin, going right back to the Gregory deal in 1982, which is a little bit before my time, up until recent years, where he would have been involved in the community coalition that a lot of organisations in the north inner city of Dublin are involved in at the moment, in a fight to try and improve services and conditions in the inner city of Dublin. The other piece of work I thought about in looking at this was a work produced by Patricia Kelleher and Kathleen O'Neill, which is on the systematic destruction of community development, anti-poverty and equality movement in Ireland. And it is a really interesting, and I would recommend anyone have a look at it, examination of the change over time of the context that we're working in. So with those sort of two pieces inspired me, I thought I would give this little potted history, just to say it's full of generalized statements. So people might want to take me up on those, but really what I wanted to do was not provide a definitive list, but try and look at a step back at how the movement and their sense of change over time. And also to point out that that change isn't necessarily always for the better. So obviously we've moved away, and it was referenced earlier, from the charity model that was really predominant in the 60s and probably 70s of dealing with poverty to, we've moved away from that, although even in the 60s and 70s there was obviously the growing influence of civil rights movement. But during that time and right up until the 1980s, in Ireland anyway, we had a very clear picture of great swathes of poverty in Ireland. There were massive urban slums. Travellers were living in appalling conditions, often on the side of the road, with literally nothing, and high levels of rural poverty. It was very visible. It was a time of massive inequality. The country appeared to be run by landowners for landowners, and that was really critical and proved to be something that had an enormous impact in later years. In particular, what we know now, but a lot of people also knew at the time, massive levels of corruption at local and national level, which particularly affected the use of land. And that has had an enormous generational impact on us to this day. Obviously, when the EAPN arrived, Ireland was emerging really from that very deep recession of the 1980s. And although the 1980s did have that very deep recession, there was an understanding that poverty existed. Now, this might sound like a bizarre point to make, but I think it's an important one because we're not really at that point now, often. So Ireland was often thought of as a monocultural society in those days, although if you speak to any travellers, they will highlight that that was absolutely not the case. And migration was definitely an outward rather than an inward pattern. In my work experience in the early 1990s, I was working in the inner city, and we at that stage were being hit by the second heroin epidemic. One of my first jobs involved interviewing women who were nursing and looking after their dying children who were dying of HIV. Because in Ireland, we also had this situation where the HIV/AIDS epidemic particularly affected the poor. It was directly linked to HIV or to intravenous drug use. And there was a huge stigma. So these women were losing their children, some of them more than one child, at a time when they were also enormously stigmatized. And those children were stigmatized because they weren't seen as the worthy contractors of HIV. It was their own fault because they'd contracted them through intravenous drug use. And there was very little recognition at the time that, you know, heroin addiction is also a consequence of poverty. So in the early 1990s, also steps from where I work now, we still had a Magdalen laundry in operation. My office is based just off Sean McDermott Street, and the Sean McDermott Street Magdalen laundry is still operating up until 1996, would you believe? And as we're aware, even it's come to light in very recent days, the commission of the investigation into mother and baby homes, that these women, and again, it's left out of the debate a lot of the time, it was these laundries and facilities like the industrial schools were there for the poor of Ireland in the main. So back to the corruption. At the moment, we're dealing with the consequences of that rampant corruption at administrative level. And one of the areas that I feel is one of the most important factors and influences on poverty, and certainly in the inner city and in Ireland, is that access to land and accommodation. So while we had these tribunals, the Moriarty Tribunal into payments to politicians and the Mahon Tribunal into land, there's very little debate and discussion about the impact and the consequences of what happened as a result of that, well, basically corruption in relation to land. We're aware, and there's anecdotal stories, that travellers, for example, were given cash payments to leave land so that shopping centres could be built. Inner city communities were moved out of where they lived, and what was built in their place? Small, pokey, non-family friendly apartments and banks and office buildings. So the most valuable land was cleared of the poor and they were moved out. Just consider this point: in the 1950s, the village of Tala had 250 people living in it. By the 1990s, there were over 100,000 people in the area. Many of them were living there, obviously, because they chose to do so, but many were living in these large estates that didn't even have footpaths, let alone basic facilities. And we were in this lag where inner city hospitals, for example, were closed, the likes of the Jervis, Adelaide, the Meath, long before the outer suburban facilities were developed. So then, as now, access to land and housing and good quality accommodation, to me, is one of the real manifestations of social injustice in Ireland and throughout the world. So in the 90s, we saw rampant interest rates. So although property was cheap, the poor couldn't afford to buy it, but the wealthy could, because anyone with cash wealth could purchase land. And public land was sold, and to accommodate who, as I've said, the banks. So now we're getting into recent time, where if you want to live in Dublin, daft.ie, I think in July or August of this year, said that the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Dublin city centre is €2,000. That would mean you'd have to earn 24,000 a year just to pay your rent. Unless somebody has public housing or a really good salary, they're being priced out. And this is something that's happening all over the world. The people who service the cities can no longer live in the cities that they service. So we move into the late 1990s and the early 2000s. In the 1990s, and I apologize for this in advance if people probably madly disagree with me, but it was almost like the golden period for community development and anti-poverty work. The equality agenda is finally really beginning to grow and develop and get political backing. We have the Rainbow Coalition, European movement and is having more influence in Ireland. Legendary battles on divorce, etc. are happening. So it's almost a golden period, in particular around community development and engagement between community and the state. It gets much stronger and it gets a little bit more equal. There's a recognition. But things changed again as we moved into the 2000s. The boom, as it's called, and the rise of the neoliberal agenda meant that we were moving further away from that again. And this is what I mean about there's this sense that everything is moving in an improved, we improve year on year, and we don't. We've obviously had a much more significant setback in our sector. We moved away from, for example, grant aiding organisations to competitive tendering, and that's where the Dublin City Community Co-op was established. And interestingly, throughout the noughties and up until this day, it's a lot of my job has actually been to prove that poverty still exists, which is a little bit bizarre, really, when we think about it. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples of this. So, for example, in the inner city, up until the early 1990s, the population of the inner city was collapsing. It was down by almost half on the previous 30 years. These pictures here you can see of the quays was what the city was really looking like right up until the early 1990s. There was massive urban decline. Post 1991, largely to do with people like Coffey, etc., there was tax incentivized investment in the city. We had massive growth of things like apartments, bank buildings. You only need to think about the IFSC. Between 1996 and 2004, over 20,000 apartments were planned or built in the area. So what did that happen, and what did that mean for the inner city? Well, it meant that we moved away from things like this to things like this, where the city moved from obvious representations of dereliction and poverty to these beautiful, shiny, pretty little buildings that the people who originally lived in these communities had no access to and no links to. Indigenous working class communities that lived in these areas were not involved in any of these and were rarely spoken to or talked to in relation to that. In my early work in an organisation called Community Technical Aid, we were one of the first ones to hire an urban planner and an architect to try and empower local communities so that they could at least have some understanding of what was being developed around them. But often we were up against massive developers, and we all know how honest developers operate in this kind of sphere. So what happened is that we've ended up in the inner city of Dublin, rather than the great swathes of poverty that we saw in the 80s and previous, we now have pockets of poverty that remain within the city. And one of the things that happens, and why I end up having to prove that poverty still exists, I'm going to show you an example here. These are from the deprivation index figures produced by Trutz Haas, who did wonderful work, and I have to admit to being a little bit of a nerd for examining these figures. I love them. So this area here that you see on the screen, you can see inside the box, is the area, is one of the EDs in the North Inner City. This area includes the Sheriff Street area, which would be around here, and the IFSC, which is around here. And when you look at the public deprivation figures in 2006, this area is coming out as, that colour says the area is mildly or marginally above average. This is absolute rubbish, okay? So up until the early 1990s, if you were to do the statistical analysis of the people who lived in this community, you would discover almost nobody went to third level. 3–4% of the population went to third level. If you look at that by small area, you can actually see it much more clearly. This is again in 2006. So the orange ones mean they're very disadvantaged, and the blue ones means they're affluent. The more blue, the more affluent, the more orange, the more disadvantaged. And what we can see here is this is the IFSC and this is Sheriff Street. So it's not one community, it's two completely distinct communities living side by side. So we were being told throughout the 1990s that poverty no longer existed in the inner city and the 2000s, because look, everyone is above average. But what happened here was that the population that previously had no third level education was now meeting an entirely new population that almost entirely had a third level education. So this population here went from having 3 or 4% having third level education to 50% having third level education. But what also happened was the population doubled. So here we have it again in 2016, the same picture emerges. The IFSC area is actually getting more affluent, this very dark blue, whereas the Sheriff Street area continues in the same position of very disadvantaged. So what was happening is that that community remained the same. The Indigenous working class community and their experience has really hardly changed, except now that they're surrounded by these lovely, pretty buildings. But they have no access to the lovely, pretty buildings. So the inner city is a pocket or a patchwork of disadvantage and affluence living side by side. And what happens is that often the disadvantaged communities are no longer able to access even the social services that were in their area because of the new populations that have moved in. Here's just some more pictures of the IFSC. It's lovely, pretty buildings. The other interesting figure, which I think is really interesting to look at, is that if you examine the census in 1996, according to the census figures, there were 12,309 people unemployed. Now, I'm not trying to blow your mind with figures, but just say slightly over 12,000 people unemployed in 1996. In the 2016 census figures, there were 12,097 people down as unemployed in exactly the same area in the inner city. That's a difference of 212 people over that 20-year period. But the percentage of people who were unemployed had absolutely dropped. It had gone from, I think it was 11% down to about 4%. And that's because the population was bordering on doubling. But the same communities were experiencing the same disadvantage. It was just now more difficult to actually see that disadvantage and to represent it and to show it. So we were ending up in this position in trying to fight poverty of, first of all, having to prove it actually still existed. In terms of today, some of the things that have happened, I believe that where the neoliberal agenda has really moved us away from even talking about poverty. Often we hear words like exclusion and disadvantage and socially excluded, but we rarely hear politicians actually talking about poverty, and we need that language on the agenda. The other thing that the community sector that we all work in, or a lot of us work in, has become more and more professionalised. And while that's important and we all must adhere to good governance and all the rest of it, it has also managed to, at times, I think, blunt the edges of the civil rights and the human rights approach to dealing with some of these issues. In terms of the fights for today, there were three that really struck me as a way forward that we really need to be looking at. One is the rise of fascism and populism. We see this throughout the world, but we've seen it in Dublin as well. This bizarre and weird collaboration at the moment between the anti-vaxxers, anti-immigration, anti-mask wearing group who, I mean, I don't know why these issues have gelled them together, but even the anti-vaccination element of it strikes me as an interesting component in relation to poverty, given that vaccination itself has been one of the most critical medical interventions in the world for children who are poor. Another area is to challenge the weak and critically underfunded education system, and in particular in the early years sector. At the moment, we're looking at the development of the new National Childcare Scheme, which is going to really negatively impact the poorest of our children. So we have this ongoing lack of recognition of early years as a positive, as a way of breaking the cycle of poverty and intervening in a positive way. And it's not going to happen should the scheme be rolled out in the way it's currently designed. And also we need to focus more on poverty and class as grounds for equality. Some of the other, and I'm not suggesting all of the equality issues have been won, they're a long shot away, but a lot of the social issues we've moved hugely forward in the last 40 years and 30 years, but issues around class and poverty are still lagging far behind. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I do apologise for the mad generalisations that you might think were over the top. I'm just going to show you, this is the shot of Sheriff Street. This was an example. Sheriff Street was one of the areas that was, I'm sorry for the blurry nature of the shot, was one of the areas that suffered the most really from the removal of the urban poor. These flat complexes were all removed. This is Sheriff Street today, and unfortunately that's often an image of Sheriff Street today. And those shots were actually taken last Saturday on Halloween down in Sheriff Street with the rubbish.
Thanks for that to Deirdre and Fintan and Olivier. So I'm conscious of time, just a few minutes over, but we wanted to give people an opportunity if they wanted to ask questions. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a, if you click on the participants tab at the end of the screen, and at the bottom you can see you can raise your hand. So if anybody wants to ask a question, can they use that facility to raise their hand? So that's the participant tab, and just underneath people's names on the right hand side it gives you the opportunity to raise your hand. So if anybody would like to ask make a comment or ask for a clarification, or ask any of the speakers a question, you can do that now. So does anybody want to ask anything or make a comment? I'm just trying to scroll through the different pages to see if there's any hands raised. No? Paul, you can't see any other hands. I can't see anyone with their hands raised. I'm just making sure. Oh, sorry, there's someone there. Aidan, is it?
Yeah, Aidan.
Yeah, Aidan, go ahead.
Just on mute. Just a comment. I think sometimes when we're looking at matters as they are, we kind of don't look enough at the framework of values of the state. And you'd be very struck every time you go to meetings or every time you have some engagement with the state, that the framework of values is very much on compassion, on charity, but doesn't extend to social inclusion. And how that plays out, you can see in various actions which are funded by the government, the prevalence of volunteer bureaus, of charity approaches, even the monitoring of the social inclusion roadmap was assigned to religious organisations who invoke a charity ethos. Now, I think many of them have moved beyond that, but it tells you a lot about the state's perception of who should be doing things and what we should be doing. So I also think that there's very little focus on, what social exclusion is and what it requires to turn it around, particularly affirmative action. As Olivier said, if we're moving to a human rights paradigm, we need to be talking about affirmative action, because unless you waste things towards the more disadvantaged communities, you won't change anything. Now so unless we can change that values paradigm of the state, that framework, either by design, by better policies, which make some sort of commitment to an inclusive society, or by demand through social movements. But we have to recognize that the NGO social inclusion sector is very much weakened and has been in the past decade. So it's a formidable task, and we need to get our heads together around how we can shift that framework of values. Thank you.
So for this part of the event, what we're going to try and do is take on what we've heard this morning and look towards the future. So just based on the inputs and our own experience, what are the lessons for the future and what will people take away? And so the same mechanism. If you want to raise your hand, click on the participants tab, and then on the right hand side of the box that comes up when you click on participants, there's a raise hand option. So click on that and I'll try and get to people as I see their hand being raised. And if people want to just type into the chat as well, if they're making a point, to type their points into the chat. So would anyone like to start? It's always the hardest to get someone to start, but would anybody like to start in terms of what you've heard this morning, or what we might think about into the future? I know that it was interesting in our breakout room, we were talking about, Deirdre's presentation and talking about the local level and talking about Finton's and Olivier's in terms of how we connect what's happening on a local level into that kind of broader space, and how difficult it has been for community organisations, as Deirdre explained, in terms of the kind of whole structure of how we work in solidarity being taken away, and often the kind of governance issues that happen at a local level, and how that's almost stopped participation in terms of how the community sector operates. So it's around what's there and how we need to move beyond that.
I can't find how to raise my hand, so can I just go ahead?
Yeah.
I mean, I was really very grateful and really appreciated the input from Olivia and from Deirdre. I was very interested to know more about Deirdre's presentation and to know more about the work they're doing. But I think one of the things, and it connects with the question that Aidan was asking about values, I think there's a big need to be more creative and to use more the arts sector and the culture sector in trying to get across our ideas. And I think that is something which they've been trying to do and doing in the inner city. And I don't know if Deirdre can say a little bit more about is that a reality and how they've been trying to use that to the arts and the cultural sort of sector to try and build support for the sort of values and the sort of changes that they're trying to, or even to highlight the realities that still exist that are often unseen.
Yeah, there actually has been quite a lot of work recently. There's a number of community drama projects in particular. We had 2 really good recent plays examining the issues of homelessness, but also intimidation, drug-related intimidation. And they were really fascinating and powerful and had an enormous impact. And actually, those pieces were delivered. One of them was at a national drugs conference. But Fintan, one of the things that has emerged from that is there's almost never any funding for it. It's incredible. Even the amount of funding we're getting for organisations as they stand, the arts are even further, community arts even further marginalised from that. Now, one of the pieces of funding, just to say really quickly, that I'm involved in, and we would have done very recently, which is sort of in and around that area. In the North Inner City, we do this huge Halloween festival called the Big Screen Festival. And it's primarily around trying to have positive ways of experiencing Halloween due to the levels of antisocial behaviour in some of the communities. And we get loads of money for that. We get money for that because they're so, they don't want their infrastructure burnt to the ground. But they don't recognise the value that it brings in itself in working with young people in creative ways. So I absolutely agree. I think we're being crippled when it comes to getting the level of funding that's required to develop a more creative approach. And whereas we're experiencing a huge additional burden in relation to governance and oversight, for the piddling amounts of money we get, the amount of oversight that is required is astounding.
Thanks for that, Deirdre. Just to reiterate, Paul has just put into the chat how to raise your hand. So you click at the end of the screen, there's a participants icon, and if you click on that, a little box comes up, and in the bottom right hand corner of that box, you can press on raise hand. So that's if you want to contribute.
Yeah, Olivier has hand up.
All right, I didn't see that. Yeah, you're on mute, Olivier.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Michelle. Yes, I apologize for taking the floor again, but I shall have to leave for another meeting that starts at 12, and I need to sort of have a short time in between the two. And so I really would like to not only thank you for welcoming me on this event, but also emphasize one point in the excellent presentation of Fintan, and connecting this to what Deirdre said in her own discussion of the developments in the inner city of Dublin. And the point is the following. I think for many years, we've been thinking of economic growth as the precondition for everything else. And in the name of stimulating growth, expanding wealth, creating wealth, we've been making choices such as in development projects that attract investors, or deregulating labor markets, or stimulating investment by tax holidays given to big companies and so on, making choices that have actually created exclusionary processes. And so we find ourselves in this situation that we develop markets, the economy, in order to boost wealth creation in the hope that that shall allow us to finance social protection. But as a result, we create the very poverty that then we seek to repair or to counteract. And so this is why the important points made by Deirdre and Fintan also oblige us to think beyond social policies as a way to combat poverty. And when Fintan emphasizes the social market economy rhetoric used in the treaty, the European treaties, It's about the social and solidarity economy. It's about combating discrimination on grounds of socio-economic disadvantage. It's about supporting social innovations that people in poverty can develop, that can provide solutions without all of this being necessarily a source of GDP growth on which the focus has been placed. And so I think it's particularly important today, since growth we know is A, not realistic, at least at the levels we've had in the 60s and 70s, B, not desirable because of the ecological impacts, but also because of the suffering it creates, right? Exhausting the ecosystems and exhausting the women and men in the economy. So I think basically a post-growth anti-poverty strategy is what we need to design and to think of. And let me close by saying that I recently was invited by the EU after some prompting to do a visit to the EU. As you know, as special rapporteurs for the United Nations, one of the tools we have is country visits. We travel for 2 weeks or so, and we meet with civil society officials and so on, and we present a report on the countries we visit. Now, I requested to do a visit to the EU. So it's not a country, but it's going to be the same thing. I'll be assessing the impacts the EU can have on combating poverty and the effectiveness of the tools it has put in place. And in this regard, the presentation by Fintan is extremely important to me, because what he shows basically is that despite good intentions being expressed since the 1992 recommendations, and indeed the first anti-poverty programs in the mid-1970s, we have macroeconomic choices as exemplified by the European semester that have really created a very different set of incentives towards privatization and states becoming competitive at the risk of creating social exclusion. So I shall stay in touch, and I have to say that the presentation by Fintan shall be especially useful to me in the preparation of this mission, for which I shall benefit from the assistance of the European Anti-Poverty Network's presence in Brussels. Many thanks to all, and thank you again for having me on.
Thank you. We were delighted to have you, and it was really informative and actually inspiring in terms of us being more creative into the future, that we have to think differently about how we can contribute to changing the discourse. Thank you for that. Take care. Yeah.
Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just conscious of time. It's about 5 to 11. So should we go on for another 5 or 10 minutes? Are people okay to do that? Yeah, I'm just trying to see. Paul, maybe you can help me if you can see anyone with their hand up to make a contribution.
There's no hands up currently.
No. I normally could talk for Ireland, so I'm trying not to hog the spotlight. But I think the challenge is, because we've heard so much this morning just in terms of processing this, because everybody who's here wants to make a contribution to making that change. And the key challenge is knowing all of this, what is it that we can do individually in our organizations and then collectively to influence what happens next. And I don't know that that's going to be easy. And I suppose for us in the EAPN, it's interesting, as Olivia said about Fintan's presentation, around the opportunities around the new architecture that's planned for the next 10 years, and what it is we can do as EAPN to try and influence all of those things that we discussed this morning in terms of universal benefits, rights-based approaches, and the values that underpin all of the things that we're trying to do around poverty, in terms of seeing it and framing it as a good society, a democratic society provides a good life for all. And I suppose that's from the message for me this morning. That I've taken away is in EAPN, how do we continue to put that on the agenda, highlight, you know, the importance of values and influence that new architecture. I'm just wondering, would anybody else like to make a comment?
Yes, a few hands up. So Irene, then Fintan, then Aidan. Yeah.
Great, I can't see those hands. I don't know why that is. Irene, Fintan and Aidan, okay?
I just have a very quick point to make. I just want to highlight a point, Deirdre, you made that I found very interesting. the constant battle in the sector to prove nowadays that poverty exists, because it isn't as visible, and the nature of how it presents itself has changed. So you have very poor people living around in areas that have surrounded by wealth. And I think as a sector, we really need to come together and have a unifying message that counteracts the narrative that poverty doesn't exist. And one of the piece of research that we use in EAPN Ireland is the minimum essential standard of living research. So when the narrative was that there was, very low unemployment, but people now had jobs and adequate wages, we were able to reference that research and say, well, actually, that's not the case. You can have a minimum wage job and still not meet all of your essential and basic needs. But I do think we need to come together with a unified message to counteract the gaslighting of poor people that kind of goes on at the moment. So that's just a point I wanted to make.
Okay, that's great, Irene. Thanks for that. Fintan, would you like to?
No, let others go ahead if I've had chances, but if there's a space, I'll come back.
Yeah, well, we'll Aidan and then back to you, Fintan. Aidan, you're on mute there.
I think, no.
Okay, Aidan, you're on mute. You're back on mute, Aidan.
Oh.
Yeah, that's, you keep putting it back on again.
Am I okay now?
Yeah, you're fine, yeah.
Okay, just very brief points. I think our side of the world, we're very good at giving out. And particularly at the moment, because it's a very grim landscape, both nationally and European wide and even globally, but hopefully there'll be a bit of light appearing across the Atlantic soon. I think we need to focus a bit on, recognizing that all the infrastructure has been taken away, that the money only goes to things that the state wants and not what we want. I think there is still some hope. I think if we're trying to bring about changes by design, then we need to influence the policy process, politically, I mean, because it's politics that decides the paradigm for life, So I think we need to engage with that in terms of setting priorities for political parties and then trying to get them into the programme for government. At Europe, there is some hope there. You have the social pillar, trying to strengthen that as a mechanism, and then the sustainable development goals, making sure they're up front. And then on the kind of community side, if you like, I think social movements, even though it's a much reduced sector, I think social movements using things as Fintan suggested, like arts, and Deirdre talked about in the inner city. But if you look at the strength of some of the social movements in the past number of years, like the water movement, which wasn't about water, it was about poverty, and marriage equality and repeal the 8th, there was significant social movements developed around those. So it is possible. So there's some hope there at all those 3 levels. Thank you.
Thanks, Aidan. Fintan, did you want to get back in there?
Yeah, I think it is important. And I think, some of the overall global context can be very negative and the general context, but there's a lot of interesting stuff happening at local levels, which I think it really helped to give us energy going forward. And I keep saying I would love to invest more in the whole question of the social and solidarity economy, which I would see what Deirdre and the way they set themselves up there being very much within that sort of a model. I'm always I don't have enough evidence and stuff, but I know that there's one of the islands in Denmark where the community got control over their own energy supply. And they created their own ownership of the energy supply for the community. And from that, they had an economic base to really do other types of modeling and developing in their areas. And I think we need to look at that sort of approach as well. How do we create wealth within our sort of community and civil society that helps us then to have a stronger voice in trying to determine the sort of model of development that we go forward with. So I think it would be very interesting to try and look. And there are, I mean, I'm not very up to date or very aware, but I know within Ireland there are very interesting practices, I think somewhere around Cork and Kerry. And that's also linked as well to this whole question of rural isolation and the lack of focus on trying to develop strategies that work for the rural level as well as for the urban levels. So I think there is things to be optimistic about, and I think that we really have to push for this sort of for a more diverse economic model, and where wealth is generated for public good and not just for private good.
Sorry, just my internet there went there for a second. I think I'm back. I'm just looking to see if there are any more hands up. I don't see any there. Paul, do you see any?
No, there's no other hands up yet, but I don't know if anybody wants to speak. But I just, myself, I think the discussion and the presentations have been very interesting. I think it's shown over time is that, like Fintan, I think others were saying at the beginning, that a lot of the focus on poverty initially was on social policy and on trying to improve social policy and strategies to address poverty, focusing just within social policy areas in terms of social protection and services and around access to employment, training and so on. But I think what others are saying, what's very obvious, is that it's much broader than that. It's about all of policy and all of government in terms of how they address it. I think when the crash came in 2008, that became very apparent. That the focus before that had just been on social policy, but it was very obvious then that we needed to far better engage with finance and expenditure and all the other areas of policy, and at government, like say Taoiseach's level here, in terms of how they were guiding the vision for society and vision for policy and so on. But I think there's been a real challenge in terms of trying to do that, in terms of trying to bring that together at that level and create a real vision around the type of society we want. And in the last number of years, like people have said as well, it's probably gone a bit backwards in that sense, that there's been a bit of brushing poverty under the carpet, denial of its existence, changing the language, cutting community organisations that were working at the very grassroots in terms of building community's voice in relation to that. And that's a real need to build back that community infrastructure and that voice. I know the resources really aren't being directed that way now, so there's a real challenge around that. Without getting people so tied up in governance and so on that they don't see the value in coming together. It has to really be grassroots led and autonomous. And I think basically it's that kind of confirmation that poverty is structural, and trying to deal with it at that structural level. It's not personal failure or even people trying to laziness or get around the system. That it is a structural issue, and trying to show that and trying to deal with it at that level.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm just looking at the time here. So we had planned at 11:05 just to get a response from the panelists. So I'm just wondering if Deirdre would like to say anything.
No, I suppose just to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I absolutely agree with what you're saying, Aidan, as well. I think it is about values, and it is about, we have to make this a political fight, because as everyone is saying, we've been so focused on sometimes survival for our communities and for our organisations. You often haven't had the opportunity to get your head up. One of the battles I really see is, as I mentioned, is land and accommodation. And we see in the inner city, for example, you can build student housing like that. You can throw up co-living at the drop of a hat, but you can't apparently build public housing for people who are in dire need. And that's a real focal point. And without somewhere safe and warm to live, what else can you do? So that would be one of the areas I would really see as critical in Dublin, but internationally as well. We see this argument in San Francisco and London and all over the world, where people can no longer afford to live in the cities that they need to live in to work.
And I think that ties into what Olivier said about a rights-based approach. So the right to housing, and I know Aidan was involved in that, the group that was
and culturally appropriate housing as well. Obviously, travellers too. There's been minimal implementation of culturally appropriate housing, despite the constant underspend of traveller accommodation budgets.
Yeah, and the subsequent issues around energy poverty, as well as poverty and all that. As you said, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if your accommodation is not safe and secure, and affordable and meet your needs, then you can't flourish as a human being. So, and I think linking that to what Olivia said about having a universal approach and having a rights-based approach, I think housing is one of those key areas.
But it just to say finally, from our experience in CTA where I used to work, so we did a lot of urban regeneration work. It's also one of the areas that we are cruelly underfunded and underprepared to tackle, because we are dealing with multinational property developers and a legal system and a planning system that we're not equipped to handle on the paltry funding we have. And it's extremely intimidating at an individual community level to try. I mean, I can tell you about communities in the North Inner City who are locked in legal battles with the likes of Johnny Rowan, and it's outright intimidation. So these things we need to resource communities and be there to support them in those kind of battles.
And from the other end, you know, if housing was constitutionalized as a right and the values that underpin that were then legislated for, you know, but as you said, we are where we are, and it's very complex in terms of how we get back to where we need to be, which is that right for everyone to have accommodation. Paul, I was just, you know, will I just ask just yourself and Fintan to give a final input and maybe close? Sorry, you're on mute, Paul.
Sorry, so Damon has his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I was just thinking one big issue that keeps on coming up is in relation to people with disabilities. We could be on the housing list for 10, 15 years and then get shoved together into cooperatives of organizations for homeless or people with disabilities, and basically end up, an awful lot of people with disabilities end up in group homes of completely diverse disabilities. And the big problem is that the organizations don't understand their needs and disabilities, and they're always being threatened with basically being kicked out or being put in mental hospital for not doing as they're told to. And this is something that doesn't come up because the fear of people with disabilities and travellers to raise issues where they have such attitudes and behaviours towards them. So this is something which has been raised a number of times, and because we're unfunded and we don't have access, we can't raise this in national meetings and infrastructure, that this is still going on, that people with disabilities and travellers are basically being deliberately ignored or shoved together in such large amounts of diverse different groups that it's unsustainable, and you know, nothing's happening. Like,
yeah, no, I think that's important, that people experiencing the issues are, you know, are part of the conversation and part of the change. And I think
we had no funding since our predecessor was defunded in 2011.
Yeah.
So our family are using our social welfare to cover myself going to meetings and training and stuff like that with Paul and stuff when we could, and it's impossible for us to use our social welfare to do absolutely everything for everybody. You know, this year a lot we're doing online. We can't use the facilities that we have in the Belgium for representing in European groups, because can't, you know, go home to Belgium to use the base department office as a base to attend meetings. People are really feeling desperate and disempowered and ignored, and people come to me, phone me up, or email me with heartbreaking stories. Over the last 9 years since PWDI was defunded, we've seen a lot more people committing suicide as a result of such behaviours, attitudes, and hopelessness. And it's heartbreaking. People I've recruited back in ICPD and PWDI days just jumped off Cliffs of Moher or off Sarsfield Bridge or whatever. It's, you know,
I'm sorry to interrupt. You know, it's really important for us to hear things like that, but I'm just conscious of time, and I don't mean to cut you off. I'm just know that the event was supposed to finish at 11:15, but I think it's really important to hear stories like yours. So, you know, to make sure that, you know, we work to make sure that organisations that support people experiencing issues like this, that we try and support people like this. Paul, just the last contribution we wanted to have, Deirdre's just spoken, so just yourself and Fintan again, maybe?
Yeah,
Just
I'm more or less spoken as well. I'll get one, two more words, but yeah, it's something else to say. Yeah.
Fintan, had you anything else to add after that? And just
I'm always something to add, so that's the problem.
like myself.
I mean, I think the thing is that you have to have the double focus. You have to have a focus on trying to work within the structures that exist to try to make whatever progress you can make. And as we build a new architecture for the next 10 years at the European level, there's a lot to be won and a lot to be lost. And so it's really important that we don't take the eye off the ball, and organizations like EAPN, Social Platform, others try to make sure that that we don't lose what possibilities from that. There was this whole new fund, resilience fund, that was being that was put out to try and help us through the COVID period. And the topic of housing and homelessness has come up so much. And I know FIANSA, the European Network of Homeless Organizations, is really working on housing first approaches. And I'm really happy to see that at least in some countries like Spain and Portugal, that they're using some of that new resilience fund that was launched by the EU for housing purposes. I would be really interested to know what's happening with that in Ireland, and I fear that it's not very positive from a social inclusion perspective. But so we have to work within all those sorts of systems, but I think we also need to find time and energy to try and keep an approach which is about winning public support for what we're trying to achieve, and not always just worrying about getting to the tables and being at these sort of inner discussions, but also being at outer discussions where we really are meeting with people and we're giving them support and encouragement, who are experiencing all the problems and have so much knowledge to bring to the discussions, and to really press a public approach, which is about building the power that's needed to really get transformations. So thanks a million for including me. For me, it was made very exciting to be part of this morning.
And just to close, because I'm conscious we said we'd finished at 11:15, I'd like to thank the speakers for informing us and for inspiring us, actually, and for galvanizing us in terms of going into the future. I mean, we all work in our own spaces, you know, at a local level or national level, fighting our own issues, and it's really important that we, like that what was created today, where we get to talk to one another and listen to one another, and create that sense of solidarity going forward. In terms of taking what we take away from today, just what you said there about there's things to be won and things to be lost, and there are opportunities, and just to continue working together and working collectively, and ensuring that we highlight and the importance of the issue of poverty for everyone, to try and change that discourse and to include the people experiencing poverty in all of the work that we do, and to be creative in that and how we do that, and how we change the discourse into the future and make a difference. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. I'd like to thank Paul for doing all the organising, and Irene and the staff in EAPN Ireland, and I look forward to future events with EAPN members. Thanks a million. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.